Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Messier, MikeMessier.com, Mike Messier YouTube channel. I'm joined today by a very good friend of mine. We've worked together in film. My friend Jaime Reborn actually interviewed me years ago for the internet for one of his websites. I believe it was called MyMovieTrailer.com. Was that right, Jaime?
Yeah, it was called watchmymovietrailer.com. Now it's called ratemymovietrailer.com, and I need some work on it to get it back up to where it was.
And then years later, Jaime and I continued a friendship over the phone. Jamie's been in Texas. I was in Rhode Island most of those years. And when Jaime went into production for his second film, his first narrative, his first film was a documentary about comedians, Surely You Jest. When Jaime was making his second film out of the Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas area, he kindly casted me as one of the roles in Write It Black, which was just about a year ago at this time, right, Jaime?
Yeah, we filmed in mid-October, so almost early to mid-October.
And you have just done principal filming for your new horror film, There Is No Sanctuary, also in Dallas, Fort Worth. So I'm very excited for you about that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, people might be thinking we're going to sit here and talk film, but we're not. We actually, we might get back to that a little bit later and how all this stuff kind of comes together. But the topic that I wanted to talk with Jaime about is near and dear to my heart and to Jaime's heart. It's the state of our country. It's the inequality in how the police are treating people. You've seen different conversations about this, and everyone's got an opinion. But what we want to get to is I want to give Jaime this forum, and I want to share some of the things we have, these late night phone calls for hours and hours. But I said, Jaime, you got to share some of these thoughts with people on a higher level, meaning that this information and these opinions that you have are not just good for me, but I think they'd be good for more people to listen to. And I just want to say thanks for being here. But let's get started, man. And I'm just trying to think of where exactly to start. But let's just start with: uh, do you feel, and not just feelings, but facts, because you're very good with having the actual facts. Is there inequality with how black men in particular are treated by the police throughout our country, the United States?
Uh, yes, there absolutely is, and the thing is that I want to first say that we certainly need everybody to be responsible and accountable for their behavior. So that's all people, right? So I don't want this to devolve into the blame game, like this is all somebody else's fault. But the way that our system is set up, and the question that you asked, yeah, because if you go back throughout the history of this country and looking at how black people were subjugated, we're just talking about the United States and pre-colonial United States, right? I mean, I understand that it's happened throughout the world, but in this country, you know, if you want to subjugate people, then you certainly have to emasculate the men. And so black men certainly are being attacked and targeted. And even through the media for hundreds of years, the images of black men have been, they've been demonized, they've been criticized, they've been vilified. We have been basically treated like we are the de facto monsters and boogeymen of society. And therefore, if you do that for so long, now it makes it easier to kill the person at a traffic stop because you've already laid that groundwork, for hundreds of years that this guy must have done something wrong. So yeah, there's certainly a difference in how black men are treated in society, no doubt about it.
And if you, not you or me, but if the hypothetical individual feels that the black person is less than human or less than them, and you and I were talking the other night about this three-fifths law from years ago, the three-fifths compromise, from was that 150 years ago. But if someone thinks someone is less than human or less than them, they're never going to treat them with the same respect or the same humanity, and that carries over into these Eric Gardner cases and George Floyd and these cases that we've seen really pop up the last 10 or 12 years. Not that they're popping up just in the last 10 or 12 years, but now the footage the technology of smartphones is in the hands of just about everybody. So not to say that these incidents weren't happening until 10 or 12 years ago, but in the last 10 or 12 years, as we've had smartphones in many people's hands, that's when we've seen this kind of growing exposure to these situations, correct?
Right, right. And the three-fifths rule that you were speaking of, that was actually in the original Constitution, and that was about representation. So since there was a high population of slaves in the South, and they weren't all black slaves, but I'll get into that later, because there was a high population of slaves in the South, and within Congress, they were kind of debating like, how do we do representation? Because as you know, we have two senators for every state, but our representatives, they come from the amount of the population, you know, as a percentage of the population. So the three-fifths rule was we're only going to count three-fifths of the slaves based on the representation that you get in Congress. That's what that was about.
And I think that when people, you know, and you and I have had these conversations, but to share with everybody, when I was growing up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, and we always distinguished ourselves as Northern Virginia because we didn't want to be associated with the other parts of the state. I'm just telling you how it is. But we always said we're in Northern Virginia. But we would always go on these field trips to the Manassas battlefield and Bull Run and all these wonderful things that are historical places. But there was always kind of this. It's hard to put an exact finger on it, but when we were being taught about the Civil War, it wasn't we weren't being taught that the South was the good guys and the North was the bad guys, but we were taught in a, I would say, I use the word ambiguous type of way, if that makes any sense, you know. And as I've gotten older and as I've explored more about history myself, talking with yourself and watching the videos of a guy named Dane Calloway that I really recommend on YouTube, I'm learning more and more that there's just so many things that were taught in history books that are incorrect. Is there anything that you'd like to share with the audience, Jamie, that you and I have talked about that are lies that we learned in school? Like, what are some of these myths or exaggerations or flat out misrepresentations of history in regards to the United States that people are being mistaught?
Well, I mean, like, well, two things. One that they both jump out at me. One is that Columbus discovered America, but that's before, long before British colonial America. But let's go back to the Civil War and with the administration of President Lincoln. President Lincoln has always been prefaced as the great emancipator, and that's one of the things that's basically it really is a lie. And this is not an attack on President Lincoln, just a factual, from a factual standpoint. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. And if you actually read it, and this is what amazes me, and I've taught this in class, I taught for about 20 years at the collegiate level, even though I taught mostly computer science, but if you actually read the Emancipation Proclamation, like if you were to bring it up right now, it would show you that it's not the document that people think it is. But most people have never even actually read it. It specifically in the language says it only frees the slaves in the states of rebellion, right? So it doesn't free the slaves in the North. So you have this premise in the movies and in TV and popular culture that the North didn't have slaves. But in fact, the North had a few slave states. And then and also too, you had, a few territories, that also had slaves. So this Emancipation Proclamation is actually jotting out and saying, oh, okay, well, you can't have slaves here, but you can have them here, here, and here, and we just ignore that part, And so, after the war, it still took, like in Texas, of course, that's in the South, but still, people talk about how the Texas slaves weren't freed. But in actuality, legally, it took a few years before slaves were freed in some of the northern states because we had to wait for the amendments to go through. Now, another one that we don't talk about, and I'll turn it back over to you, is called the Corwin Amendment, Corwin, the Corwin Amendment. It was going to originally be the 13th Amendment. So what happened in the Corwin Amendment is that because the southern states had been talking about, leaving, about succeeding, there were these measures like, okay, we really don't want to have a war. We really don't want to, to have these guys leave. But so what we're going to do is, fine, guys don't leave. We'll go ahead and give you slavery. We'll allow it. Perpetual slavery in the United States. Lincoln signed off on this, basically. The Congress signed off on this. But by that point, the southern states were like, we don't need your approval. We're not trying to get your consent anymore. We're going to leave. And so it was like that situation caused the Corwin Amendment not to pass, because once it passes in Congress for an amendment, you have to get like 3/5 of the states to pass it. So the Civil War actually stopped the Corwin Amendment, which would have given the South what they actually wanted. But another thing that the South also wanted was they basically had the human resources. They were making a lot of money off of slaves and cotton. And they just decided that, look, we don't have to share the proceeds of this money with the North. And then the North was like, no, you're not going to keep our money. And that's what the crux of the Civil War was about. Yes, was a part of it slavery and fighting for and against slavery? Absolutely. But it was money. The Southern states were like, no, we have all this money. We have basically the industries, the commerce here. We don't have to share this with the North. And that's what the war was really about. Because my point in saying that is that if you were to hear most people talk about the Civil War, even in like public schools or whatnot, it would seem like the United States said, we're gonna outlaw slavery, and then the war started. That's not what happened. When the Civil War started, slaves were legal all over the country. So with the Southern states, remember, they didn't create slavery. They were just trying to enforce the laws and the rights that had been given to them under the United States Constitution. So it's not like they made it up. But that's how when you hear this talk about the Civil War, it's almost as if we're saying, well, the United States decided that they didn't want slaves anymore, and then the Southern states said, no, we're going to keep slaves. And it didn't happen that way. That's not the way it happened. This became a situation about money. And so the Emancipation Proclamation, this was about interfering with the labor force for the South. Because if the slaves were able to leave, then you wouldn't be able to make money. You wouldn't have your industry. And so that's really what it was more about than what the media and history books tell you.
It's almost like these history books want to simplify things. The problem with simplifying complex matters is that the nuance, the detail gets so lost and blurred out and then people, once you get to a certain point where you realize that some of these history books, some of these grammar school books are incorrect or overgeneralized at the most forgiving, then you kind of question everything you've learned, and that can be dangerous too. And so it's very complex stuff. One thing I did want to mention is that you mentioned the northern states having slaves. Well, I lived for many years in the state of Rhode Island and Providence plantations, which is
right.
Which Rhode Island takes great pride
right.
in exclaiming to whoever will listen, we're the smallest state with the longest name. But if you think about the resource of that name or the inspiration of that name, the Providence plantations, and of course they'll always want to say, well, the plantations doesn't necessarily mean slave plantations, but guess what? At the time it did. So there you have it. Now you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas area, Jamie. And, I remember when I visited you to work with you on that film, Write It Black, a year ago, for some of the filming. I think it was either the first or the second night that I was there in Dallas-Fort Worth. There was a very horrible situation where a woman was playing video games with her nephew, African-American lady playing video games with her nephew in the nephew's apartment that he had with his parents. So the aunt is over there to visit. Some neighbor across the street calls and says she sees something going on in the apartment. The police come. They didn't bother to knock on the door, apparently. They didn't bother to call the house or to call the apartment. They just shot. They shot this poor lady like a sharpshooter through the glass door and killed this woman. And what is she doing wrong? Nothing. She's playing video games with her nephew. And I remember that, most of the cast of Bright at Black, I'd say 70 to 80% were African American, or 65%, something like that. And we were all kind of just upset and torn up about it. But of course, the folks that were African American, or what we call African American, were more upset, and rightfully so. It was a very disturbing situation, which is kind of the segue to the next, part of our conversation. But can you give more details on that exact case or where it stands now, Jamie? Remember when I'm talking about that case?
Yeah. Yeah, I do remember the case. I don't know. I know that the police officer has been fired. I don't know what the criminal aspect of it is at this point. But yeah, she was at a house, and I don't recall the specific circumstances. But she was babysitting her nephew, and they were playing video games. And so yeah, he was shot. And you see these things popping up all over the country, and you're just wondering, like, what was the trigger that made you have to fire a weapon? Did you see a weapon? Were you threatened? And you wonder what's going on. And see, what my belief is, and this is not a peer evaluated thing here, what I'm going to say next, but my belief is that the negative imagery of Black people throughout the history of this country, it is helping to cause and foster that type of fear, And so it's like when you're a movie buff, I'm a movie buff, you're an actor, I'm an actor. If you see the way that Black people have been portrayed in Hollywood for many, many years, especially Black men, that for some people, that's the only interaction that they have with Black people on an everyday basis is the characters that they see on TV. And so, so the officer was fired. I believe he was charged, but I'm still trying to figure out, at what point did he believe that it was necessary to fire his weapon? She was in the house. So what did you see? And like, I don't know this to be a fact, but I just don't believe that he would have shot a white person looking out their window. I just don't believe that. If he were in a white neighborhood and he was walking, and like you said, why didn't you knock on the door? And with the call, Mike, it wasn't as if somebody was saying, like, there's been some shooting going on, or somebody's dead, or somebody's been shot and hurt. So what is this heightened sense of fear that you just can't talk to the people? Well, I mean, I don't get it, but I'll have to find out to see what's going on with the case. But it's very hard to prosecute these cops. There's a lot of basically jury nullification going on, even though we see the videos that these guys are still getting off.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back, at least to the Rodney King case, 1992, where there's this clear, video of these cops just teeing off on the guy, and they all walked, and that's when we had those 1992 riots. And
right,
you've been sharing with me some links and videos. What state was it, Jamie, that the African-American guy was in his car on his cell phone? A woman from across the street calls and says it looks like he's waving a gun. And, 2 or 3 cops come over to this guy, and he's got to, get out of his car and explain that, no, he doesn't have a gun. He's just on his phone. And as you pointed out, one of the cops says, well, why do you think someone thinks you have a gun? Well, why is it this guy's responsibility to put himself in the shoes of someone who's calling him on him? And it is a frustrating situation, which you've told me about. It's like the police don't take full responsibility because they're only doing their job, responding to the phone calls. And the people that make these phone calls on Black men, they're not given full responsibility because they're told as citizens, hey, do your job, and if you see something suspicious, call the police right away. But it seems like for them, the people making these phone calls, any black man is suspicious just by being there at all.
Right, right. So that state was Ohio, Mike, and that one, I'm glad that nobody was hurt. But if you try to evaluate the situation just from an objective standpoint, not make it personal, okay? If Ohio is an open carry state, right, meaning that if you're over 18, you can walk around with a weapon. So now, this guy though was sitting in his car. So the call, Mike, was not that this guy is pointing the weapon at somebody, this guy is menacing, this guy is shooting. That wasn't the call. So if it's an open carry state, why can't you have a weapon in your car? Now, when the police show up, now remember, they're saying that the woman is across the street, but the police show up as they get close. One of the police officers says at some point, either on that video or in reference to what he saw when he got there, he said, "Oh, I think that's just a cell phone." But as these police officers approach the car, none of them see a weapon, right? So I want to make sure that I preface this properly. None of them see a weapon as they're a few feet from him, but the woman across the street saw one with him sitting in his car. So now, if he did have a weapon in an open carry state, what if he was moving the weapon from his seat to his glove compartment? Is that illegal? You know, so if the police don't see a weapon, what do they need to get involved for if it's an open carry state? He's there by himself. It's not like he has somebody kidnapped or there's another person there. We got to make sure that if they're safe or not.
Right.
So what are they even involved for here? And then you notice they get his hands out, they pat him down, get him out of the car, and then they search the car. So why are they searching the car? If it's an open carry state, what are they searching the car for? Now, had he shot somebody or there was an accusation of there was a shooting and they want to check that, fine, search his car for the weapon if he's a menace. But it's not illegal. So what you're saying is you're going to have to go to everybody in every parking lot on that block and search them for weapons. If yeah, it's open carry, but we have to search everybody for weapons. So what are you searching this guy for? So then, like you said, one of the police officers asked the guy, well, why would you think that, why do you think that she would call the police and say you had a gun? Well, one, what if he just said, well, because I'm black? Or two, I understand why the officer did that. The officer did that because if that man comes and says, oh, well, I was moving pretty fast or I was doing this or that, then the officer is going to use his own words against him to say, oh, well, that's the reason why she said that, because you said that you were combing your hair or you were whatever. I'm going to use that against you. The guy said he was doing this. So, but it's a ridiculous question, though. And then they ask him for his identification. If it's an open carry state, you saw he had no weapon, and you notice that this is kind of later in the video. So why are you asking him for his ID later in the video? Because what you want to do is run a check on the guy and see if he has a warrant. So if he has a warrant, then hey, all is good, and then you can get the guy and arrest him. But there's no part of this that makes sense. Where was the crime? Just because you're black, that doesn't make a crime imminent. So, and I'll finish this up and turn it back over to you. I'm just saying, she called and said he had a weapon in his car. That in and of itself is a crime? That doesn't make any sense. But that's what they did. And so they're okay with this. And we're just checking because this, that, and the other. But these calls to the police and the police behavior, dude, that goes back hundreds of years. It is a symbiotic way of oppressing black people and gaslighting us as if racism doesn't exist. Because anything that guy had on him, anything that he did, because they were looking, because first they said gun, but then they were saying any weapons. The police were looking for any weapons. So if it's an open carry state, you're basically saying that he doesn't have a right to have a weapon in his car. So it didn't make any sense at all. But I'm done.
Well, here's the thing that you've talked about with me several times, which is, let's get to the big topic here, or one of them, but you've used the term, and I understand now because you've explained it to me, human trafficking. Human trafficking, which basically, well, I'll let you take it from there because I don't want to misquote it or misinterpret it. But please take us to that topic of the human trafficking in regards to all of this.
Well, basically, human trafficking is essentially the exploitation of people, whether it be through chattel slavery, whether it be through prostitution, or a myriad of ways of exploitation. So in the United States, and pre-colonial America, or pre-colonial, British colonial America, I'll use that term, British colonial America, which was the precursor to the United States. Black people and white people and Native Americans and other people, they were held as chattel slaves and trafficked primarily by white people. But what happens is that although some of the laws change and it becomes it's not politically correct to do some of these things, but you still want to make your money. And so what you have to do is kind of change the laws or interpret the laws in a way that still allows you to get across what it is you're trying to get across. If you look at the 13th Amendment, okay, and the 13th Amendment came after the Civil War. But basically, if you read it, the 13th Amendment says that there shall be no involuntary servitude in the United States or its territories unless you are duly convicted of a crime. Now, the prison system that we see now, and now obviously from the 1980s, it's exploded. But the modern prison system that we see, this kind of started after the Civil War, because during the antebellum, which is pre-war, in antebellum United States, look. You had the slaves on the plantations for the most part. You didn't need to put them in prisons. But then once you have that time period over with, we got to figure out how we can still make this money. They're not just going to give up the money. These rich business owners and rich plantation owners, they're not just going to give up that money. And so they found ways legally to still traffic Black people. And the prison system is basically the modern ancestor, it is the modern descendant, to the slave system. So when the police are using situations like that, like they did in that situation in Ohio, they're using any pretense to engage you, because that's what they're trying to do anyway. And so what if this guy had a gun, Mike? What if he had a gun on him? I mean, the thing is, look at the police. They had to search for it. If you don't see it, what are you searching for it for if it's an open carry state? There's no reason to search for it.
This guy was about as polite and as accommodating to these police officers as one could be. And I could be wrong, but it did sound like the police officer running the camera sounded Black to me. I could be wrong, but it
sounded that way to me as well.
Right, but it sounded like the officers weren't horribly rude to him, but they did, in my opinion, I could be wrong, especially with the searching of the car. It seemed like they were looking, as you said, they were looking for any reason to have something against this guy. And that leading question of, why do you think someone would call us about you? I mean, if that's not in court, that would be like a leading question. That would be thrown out. I mean, that objection, Your Honor. I mean, that's indicting yourself. You know what I mean? To answer that type of question. But this guy who was pulled over was terribly respectful to the police officers. And in that video, it says something to the effect of he is considering, or he is asking the police to charge the woman who made the phone call. And then, of course, you always get this kind of pat answer of, well, we don't want our citizens to feel like they can't call us. It's very complicated, Jamie. Here's kind of another big topic question. This notion of defund the police, I haven't really wrapped my head fully around it. But what do you think of that topic? Off the top of your head, the defund the police notion or movement or idea. How does that strike you?
I think that what is what is challenging that is the name of the movement, and I don't know who decided to call it that, but I think from what I have gathered and listening to the people talk, what they're talking about is like just a redistribution. Now, don't get me wrong. There might be some who are saying we actually want to defund the police, but most of the people that I have heard and talked to, what they're saying is that we are putting a lot of resources into policing when we wouldn't need to if we would put that money into jobs and you know after school programs and health programs and mental care programs and whatnot. And so I agree with it in that regard, that we should certainly try to do some redistribution, because I believe in my heart of hearts, and I believe that the elites in this country, they know this. If more people had viable jobs, I think we would see less crime. And I don't think that that's a novel idea. I believe that there is a contingent in this country, and it has always existed, that they want to engage in human trafficking because the foundation of our country, Mike, was human trafficking. Our military system is built on it. Our finances system is built on it. Our social system is built on human trafficking, because with slavery, you get the entire, with chattel slavery, you get the entire life labor of somebody, all their resources. So if all the stuff that Mike Messier is doing with the podcast, with the acting, with all the things that you're doing, if somebody else received 100% of the benefit for that, that's how this country became so wealthy, because of the trafficking. And so if you can keep people poor, if you can keep them emasculated, docile, if you keep arresting Black people and you keep them in trouble with the law, then if they do get a job, they're going to have to take the lower jobs. They're going to have to take the lesser jobs, less money, less status. And so then then the white elites get to maintain their status. And that's what's going on. So with the defund the police, I'm not for not having police forces, but you're talking about we need a redistribution of these funds. Like, for instance, and I'll say this and I'll turn it back over to you because I want to elaborate on this later on as well. If you look in the Black community, you have so many Black men that don't have jobs. And you'll hear people that will say, these Black men, they're just not trying. Well, I'm telling you, as somebody who has 7 college degrees and working on my 2nd PhD, I tried. I had to pretty much go into business for myself, because it was like I went from being underqualified, I jumped right over qualified to overqualified, So, but the welfare recipients, even though technically, from a percentage standpoint, more white people receive welfare than Blacks, but there are a lot of Black women who are receiving welfare. I have never, ever heard anybody say there's not enough money for the welfare that these women are getting. I've never heard that. I've never heard a Black woman that I know say, I went to cash my welfare check and it bounced. There was no money in there. We talk about all these other funds, Social Security, Medicaid, and all these things that, we're having problems, there may not be enough money. I've never heard them say that about welfare. So my point is that if Black men can't find jobs, if there's no money to give us jobs, where's this money coming from that they can give our women for leaving us to raise the children on their own? It's purposeful. They've done this on purpose. Because if there's money so with welfare, she gets an apartment or a house, she gets medical care, and she gets cash. So you mean to tell me that you can't redistribute this money into jobs for families? And I'm not taking away our responsibility as Black people. I'm not saying that. We have to be responsible. But I'm saying I know that the government understands the mathematics of that. They understand it, and they are purposely putting that into place, because many people today will tell you, well, we're only doing the welfare system because Black men won't be responsible for their kids. In 1964, and this is a peer evaluated source, there was a Monahan report done in 1964. And the Monahan report, it said, oh, wait a minute, 25% of Black families are having, they're single parent families. Children, 25% of black mothers basically they're bringing in children out of wedlock. So they said, oh, that's a travesty. That's a tragedy. We got to do something about this. And then a few years later, they began to institute formal and federal child support laws. So if you keep black men from getting jobs and you put them on child support, now you have another backdoor way into putting them in prisons. Now, we're not supposed to have debtors' prisons in the United States. They're not supposed to be, legally, they're not supposed to be debtors' prisons. That's in the Constitution. But they'll put people in jail, primarily black men, for child support all day, every day. But they know exactly what they're doing. So as far as the defund the police, I think they're using the wrong term. I would call it something else. But they do need to reevaluate these funds and make them available for helping the citizenry.
There's been something that's come up several times in our conversations, and also, various things on YouTube that I've seen and other online sources that make the assertion that the police in our country, United States of America, were originally enrolled for basically rounding up runaway slaves. And I believe you've informed me about that, and I've looked into that as well. Can you give the watchers of our interview here more information on that, Jamie?
Yes. Okay. So basically, a substantial part of our police force as it exists today, it evolved from slave patrols. And it's just one of those things that over a period of time, that an amalgamation of circumstances, basically they helped to form the police department. As I was telling you, during slavery, black people were on plantations. So black people did not represent the prison population in the 1800s that they do today, because they had them on plantations, okay? So if they ran away, we brought them back to a plantation. When you ran away from a plantation, they didn't put you in prison and say, oh, you ran away from the plantation, you got to be in prison now. So they had people, in the communities that were paid to, patrol and make sure slaves hadn't gotten away, and, and check their passes and whatnot. Well, after the Civil War was over with, now you have laws against vagrancy, and people are checking for slaves. And so you got to find a place to put these people. So you had a lot of prison camps with the only crime that these guys had done was vagrancy. Now, this stopped around World War II because then they needed manpower for the war. Okay. So, but before that, if you look at, and you and I are both, TV movie buffs. I think I've said this to you before off camera, but there are some hints in our media. If you look at a lot of the Westerns, no matter what it is, whether you're watching Bonanza or Gunsmoke, all these shows, right? There is almost never an actual police force on those shows. It's always a sheriff or a deputy or a marshal and a deputy, a couple of deputies or whatever, okay? And then if something really goes bad, then they'll deputize a lot of people or whatever, and they got to get a posse or whatever. So they're kind of giving you a glimpse as to what those cities kind of look like. Now, but after the Civil War, when you got all these vagrant black people walking around different places, now we got to hire more people, to watch and protect our stuff. And so a good core of the police force did evolve from that. So that's actual fact.
That case that really caught everybody's attention, Jamie, earlier this year, I think it was even before George Floyd on Memorial Day, but it was the bird watcher, the guy that liked to watch birds. And he was in Central Park in New York City. And I guess this lady, he's an African-American guy or a black guy. This white woman is walking her dog, and the dog is unleashed, and it's a leash law. You got to have your dog on a leash. And so they get into a little debate or a little verbal altercation about the legalities of the dog being on the leash or not. He actually prepares himself for these types of situations. I guess in Central Park, he's been bird watching before, and he's experienced people with dogs bigger than hers that aren't on leashes. So he actually comes prepared with a couple of dog biscuits on him in case something like this comes up. He gives the dog a dog biscuit. She gets upset, and she threatens to call the police on him with the keywords, something to the effect, I'm not exact quoting her, but I'm going to call the police and tell them that a black man is threatening me and my dog. Meanwhile, she's got this leash horribly tied around the dog's neck, and you feel bad for this dog. And apparently somebody looked into this woman's background, and she had various photographs on her Instagram account or whatever of the dog in precarious states of peril. So the dog might be better off without this lady, who knows? But this go, and I guess I don't like the term Karen, because I do have a cousin named Karen, so I feel that name has gotten unfortunately a bad rap, the last couple of years. But the bigger picture is, white women especially, or white people in general, are calling the police a lot of times when they don't have to. A lot of times they're doing this, and in this particular case of the dog walker versus the bird watcher, it was like a instrument of power, an instrument of threat, a power dynamic that she was flexing to assert herself, that she had the right to walk the dog without the leash, and he had to just go along with what she wanted. What's your thoughts on that case in particular, and this Karen thing in a bigger sense?
Well, see, that case kind of epitomizes the problems that we are faced with and the lack of equality that we are faced with, because in life we are all going to have disagreements with people. You grow up, you have disagreements with your brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, other family members, friends, classmates. You have disagreements. So what society is basically telling us as black men, that black man, if you have a disagreement with anybody other than another black man, then we're going to side against you off the cuff. Now, and that didn't happen in this situation because the police actually charged her, but had it not been filmed, imagine what could have happened to that guy. Now we talked about this before off camera, but if you look at the Central Park Five, I'm not going to go back and relitigate the case. I'm just saying, though, the victim in the case, she was in no position to identify her attacker. Okay, and I'm glad that she made as close to a full recovery as possible. But the only thing that they used against these guys was their supposed confession. Okay, in the Central Park Five. So you asked a moment ago, which I brought up to other people since I saw the video. You asked a moment ago. You said you brought up the police officer asked the guy in Ohio in the car, why would the woman say that? That's the same lines of that confession. We don't have anything, so we're gonna use that against you. So now they're saying that they confessed, but over time people say, well, they were kids and you forced them to confess and you didn't do. So we're not gonna get the benefit of the doubt. And there's many cases of this. Like if you look into the Emmett Till situation, this woman came out about 4 or 5 years ago and said, it wasn't true. It didn't go down the way that they're saying. He didn't deserve that. He didn't do that. And, and now they're not charging her, they're not charging her for that. And I'm not saying that they should or they shouldn't, but the way that we get over policed, they have no problem charging us for just about anything and everything. If we violate the law, or if it looks like we violated the law, we'll get charged. So, if you look at like there was a Nazi, a Nazi guard from one of the camps. He was supposedly 17. He's still alive, and they prosecuted him, sent him back to Germany and whatnot. And he was convicted just a few days ago. So World War II is now working on 80 years ago. Okay, so that's 80 years. But like if we bring up, like with the statues of the Confederacy, and we'll talk about that later on in the podcast, I guess. But the Civil War was over in the 1860s. So these statues, if you talk 80 years from the Civil War, which would be like, the 1930s, 1940s, okay, you're now celebrating these people. You're celebrating the Confederates. And I'm not saying that you should or that you shouldn't. I'm just saying the same time frame, about 80 years later, they're getting all these statues, and you're saying to Black people, no, there's no racism and get over this, but you're still prosecuting Nazi soldiers from 80 years ago because of that pain being so real. But we're being told, not quite. So back to the woman in Central Park, I'm saying that this goes back for years. So the woman who lied on Emmett Till, she's still alive, but she's not being prosecuted. And that was a landmark civil rights event. That was a watershed moment. And these guys killed Emmett Till, were acquitted, and then right afterwards did an interview confessing to it. Now, if a Black person did that, I don't know what the law would be. Oh, but they'd find a way to charge you. Believe me, if you got off for something and then confessed to it, oh, believe me, they'd find a way to charge you for something. So anyway, I'm done.
Well, you have a case like the O.J. Simpson case, which 1994, and let's just say for argument's sake, he did do it. So you have one Black guy killing two white people, and we're making movies about it. We're making miniseries about it. John Travolta's playing his lawyer. We've got so many people 25 years later that are still gung-ho about that case. And granted, celebrity in Los Angeles and the dynamics of it was extraordinary. And so maybe that's not the best example, but it is an example that there's a disproportionate amount of upheaval or attention when a Black guy gets away with two deaths. But look at all these cases. I mean, there's been several this year that have bothered me. One of them was George Floyd we could talk about for a week, so maybe we'll try to stay off that specific case because there's so many cases. But the one about a month after George Floyd, the gentleman in the Wendy's parking lot in Atlanta, Georgia, I traveled a lot these last 2 years in moving, Jamie, as you know. And one thing that I just started doing is if I get tired while driving, I'll pull over and I'll pull over into a fast food place or a Walmart and take a nap in my car, and nobody ever bothers me. Well, it seems like this guy was trying to do the right thing. He didn't want to drive home tired. He pulled over to a Wendy's fast food restaurant to take a nap in his car. And whether he was blocking the fast food line or not, somehow he's getting shot in the back, and he grabbed the taser, and then the next thing you know, that Wendy's is being burned down to the ground, and it's just so disconcerting to see these cases. What do you think? What do you think happened that 2020, Jamie, is the year that everything has hit the fan? Is there any? Is it Trump? Is it other things? Is it coronavirus? What about this year is where all this stuff is boiling over from the surface?
I think there are a myriad of issues, but with the George Floyd situation, I think that from my perspective, what happened with that one was a situation in which Mr. Floyd had been subdued, and we saw him subdued. So it wasn't like he was in the midst of fighting. It wasn't even like they weren't fighting. It was visible that you could see the guy was being subdued, and then you had three guys holding him. And so I think that really struck a chord because that was even less defensible than some of the other cases. But you see, and the thing is, what I've noticed is that you're seeing these Black people that are being killed, and they're on tape being killed, and still we have this, well, what about this and what about that? So I think that we have built up such a cachet of these deaths on camera, and you're hearing this, well, if they had just cooperated, if they had just complied with the officer, and that's another form of gaslighting. It's just not true because you see these situations with unruly white people all the time, and they're not being shot up. And so you and I saw the video where the guys is fighting the two cops, the male and the female, and he steals their car. They're not shooting, you know. And so, but I think that the cachet has just been built up, and there's just so much of it now, that and like with President Trump's administration, I'm not a President Trump basher or anything like that, but I think that some of the comments that have come out with the administration, like with the how he called the football players sons of bitches and stuff like that, there's a little bit of there's some elements of this rhetoric that's a bit tone deaf, because I understand respect for the flag. I get it. I understand what people are saying. And when people say, well, we fought, my ancestors fought for this. I get it. I understand that. But don't use that to try to gaslight us as if you don't understand that there's racial oppression going on in this country. And the thing is, Mike, this is not a meritocracy. The United States is not a meritocracy. And we don't want to, as a country, we don't want to address that issue. It's not a meritocracy. It's not about, well, you busted your behind, you went and got your degrees, or you worked hard, and now you're in this position. That's not what it's about. Because a lot of these positions that we're getting, all of us, a lot of the positions that you get, they are appointments. People are putting you in that position, whether it be a big corporation, small corporation. And the elites, they know this. If you go back to Reconstruction, which was the period right after the Civil War, and I'm going to tie this together. One of the reasons that there was talk of having a second Civil War or a second fight, like not long after that, is because many of the white people who had served in the Confederacy, if they had served in the Confederacy, or if they had served in the Confederate Congress, they were not allowed to hold public office anymore. So what happened is that, whether you want to call it out of spite or whatever, a lot of black people who had been slaves just a few years before, now they were appointed to, situations of power where they were put in Congress. We had like we had Hiram B. Rebels. He was the first black senator. He took over one of the, like Jefferson Davis became president of the Confederacy, and he was a senator from South Carolina. Well, there were two senators in South Carolina, and Hiram B. Rebels took over one of the spots. I don't think it was Jefferson Davis, but I can't remember the other senator's name. But anyway, so this made white people livid, because some of these guys weren't even elected; they were just appointed. And so Reconstruction only lasted for a few years, because what happened was, in 1877, they had a compromise of 1877. So what happened this year was Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden were running for office. Rutherford B. Hayes was from the North, and Samuel Tilden was from the South. And we had a situation kind of similar to with President Clinton with Secretary Clinton and President Trump. And then before that, with Vice President Gore and President George W. Bush. Samuel Tilden received the popular vote. Rutherford B. Hayes got the electoral vote. And there was talk about whether or not the South was going to honor that. So what happened was they came with a compromise. They let Rutherford B. Hayes have the presidency, so there was no Civil War. But what happened was they basically had to end Reconstruction. So they had to pull the northern troops out, so there was no more protection for the black people. The Ku Klux Klan, that was their heyday initially. They ran wild at that point. And now the white people who had been in the Confederacy, they could have jobs again. They could run for office. They could be judges. They could be, in Congress. And so, but they knew that these appointments, these guys, a lot of these black politicians, they weren't popularly elected. So that really incensed the white people at that time. Now, if you fast forward to the future, the way our country is set up, let's go until like the early part of the 20th century, where we had the legacy acts in college, where you had students who could get into school if their dads or mothers had gone to those schools. And those things are still in place. And they were specifically designed in writing for that, because they knew that there were foreigners coming from all over the world to the United States, and they knew they were going to be trying hard. They were going to be busting their behinds to get into these schools. And so they knew that their kids probably wouldn't, because they had been Americanized or whatever, or United Statesized, however you want to call it. So they purposely built that in so that they wouldn't have to compete. And now today, many white people who are saying, well, quit complaining, just work hard. That's not the way the system is structured. We're not getting things because we worked hard. You should, but that's not the way our country is set up. So with the way our infrastructure is built, is designed to ensure that the elites stay in power, regardless of whether or not they have the mental, professional, or other faculties to maintain that position. I'm done.
Well, that's like nepotism taken to the next level, you know, and just in my own life, just to relate to that without it being as big a thing, just personal experience. As you know, I'm a big, you know, pro wrestling fan, and because I have no family in that world of professional wrestling, it hasn't happened that I've gotten a paid job in that world, and most people that do, or many that do, are the benefactors of nepotism. Nepotism benefactors. You're not talking about nepotism per se of just looking out for one's own family, but the infrastructure of looking out for the elite or the chosen, or these, as you said, in college. I remember that.
Right.
When applying to college, I remember those legacy grants, or if your parent is a teacher or a professor at the college, you might get a free ride to the college. Well, that's great for that kid, but not the kid that might have gotten a scholarship or gone to that school otherwise. I did want to go back to a point that you touched upon. These Confederate statues, you know, here I am in Florida, and you know, they did take down a statue here in Jacksonville a couple of months ago. But a lot of these statues were not even above, they weren't even there during the actual Civil War or before the Civil War, which is a real interesting point. A lot of these supposed Confederate statues were put up in the 1950s, the 1960s, up to the 1970s. Basically, I believe the group was called the Daughters of the Confederacy. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's right.
The Daughters of the Confederacy. I mean, talk about the original Karens. Once again, apologies to anybody named Karen out there, but these women wanted to evoke this sense of their own perceived notions of what history was or what should have been, and they went on this great campaign, great for themselves, of getting all these Confederate leader statues up, and you have things like Stone Mountain, Georgia, and with this light show and so forth at night. But it's kind of a misconstrued or a misdirected vision of history. I mean, what we know is the Stars and Bars Confederate flag that's on the General Lee, on the Dukes of Hazzard. That flag really didn't even exist for the most part in the South. Right. And so when people think they're evoking, you know, their Southern heritage, they might have their own miscalculated or they've got it all wrong, or they've got a good portion of it wrong. Is there anything in that, what I just said, that you want to further explore, Jamie?
So when Strom Thurmond was running in the late 1940s, you know, he was the one, his campaign, they popularized the flag that we see now. I forgot which Confederate military division used the Stars and Bars, but I think
it was the Northern Virginia. Ironically enough, where I was born, the Northern Virginia war flag or battle flag that I saw. Keep going, buddy.
Right. Yeah. So right. And so it was popularized by, you know, in Strom Thurmond's campaign in the late 1940s. But you know, see, now for me, this one is a difficult one for me, because like with everything that I've seen, I'm more concerned with immediately arresting officers who we see on camera killing people who are unarmed. Now, I'm not saying this to be disrespectful in any way to anyone's beliefs, but I've talked about this with many Black people as well, and I see it differently from a lot of people. I could really care less about the Confederate statues coming down or the Confederate flag coming down. And I don't say that with any support for or against. And I'll say it, and here's why I feel that way. I have the same feelings about the Confederate flag that I do about the United States flag. To me, they are one and the same. And I understand that many people might be offended by that, but that's not my intent to offend. I'm a soldier. I fought, for this country. I'm a combat veteran from Desert Storm. I was an infantry soldier. So it's not disrespect, but as a scholar, as a teacher, as I look back through the history of this country, the Confederacy lasted for only 4 years. Okay, from 1861 to 1865. So I don't see anything that Black people went through during the Confederacy in the South that we didn't go through before the Confederacy in the United States, during the Confederacy in the United States, and long after the Confederacy in the United States. So to me, the way that we try to frame is kind of like, to me, a part of it, and I know people don't mean this is just the way I interpret it, is kind of like another manipulation of the facts or the context of this country to act as if we're going to dwarf racism down to just the South or just to the Confederacy in those 4 years. Because after the Confederacy, we were still in slavery in this country, in the North and South. We were still beaten. We were lynched. The Ku Klux Klan rose to power. Then they died out and rose to power again. But Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, that was under a United States flag. The Dred Scott decision in 1857, that was under a United States flag. The United States Constitution, that was conceived under a United States flag. The Tuskegee experiment, that was conceived under a United States flag. Right now, where we have the age of mass incarceration, where all of these Black men are being funneled to the prisons, in all of those courts, there's a United States flag. So for me to say, well, we're going to take this flag down, as if that's, and I'm not saying that it doesn't work for other people, or that I'm not saying we should or shouldn't. I want to see people not murdered by police officers. I want to see people have better opportunities for jobs. I want to see this country become a more perfect union, and I want to see it become a meritocracy. So if taking down the statues, if that does that, if that helps that, then fine. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but the way I see the Civil War, and I'll sum this up real quick and turn it back over to you. It would be like, let's say you have a mob boss who works in Washington, D.C., right, in the North or whatever. And this mob boss has a lieutenant, and this lieutenant is down in the South, let's say South Carolina or whatever. And the lieutenant in South Carolina says, hey, you know what? We've been doing the racketeering down here and the prostitution and the gambling. And you know what? We're not going to share this money with the people up in the North. We're not going to share this with the Washington, D.C., with the boss in Washington, D.C. So the boss in Washington, D.C. says, no, to heck with that. We're going to go down there and show him what's what. So now they fight. The mob boss up north comes down and says, this is what's what, and we get our stuff back. And then you put a new lieutenant in place to do the exact same thing. And you just blame the old lieutenant and say, well, he was the problem. That's kind of the way that I see how we couch the Civil War, like these bad people from the South, because I understand when they talk about heritage. I know some people might be offended. I'm a Black man with all the stuff that I've said before, but I do get that part. I do get it. I understand when they're saying this is heritage. I understand why many of these, bank robbers, some of them, like maybe maybe not exactly, but like Frank James, Jesse James, a lot of these bank robbers, I understand why they're heroes, because many of the a lot of them were from the South, and many of them felt like, hey, look, we're robbing these banks to get money to help our people. I'm not saying that that's the truth, but that's the sentiment from a lot of people. So this idea that you have just, the Southern people, they were just so evil, and and they just wanted slaves. To me, it's almost like that's another part of the gaslighting, because remember, the country was started about 80 years before the Civil War, so that they had already been slaves. It wasn't like they thought of it. They were just saying, well, we're not going to share this money. And so that's where so when you say, like, when people say, well, we're going to bring these statues down and bring these flags down, if it doesn't change the behavior, what good is it? Now, I'm not saying that for some people it may be a start, but I just don't see the flags as any different, because they're representing the exact same things. To me, they are. They represent the same things to me, because the United States flag, it also represented slavery for years. So I don't understand how that Confederacy so from 1976, we'll say, I'm sorry, 1776, we'll say, up until the Civil War, which is 1861. So you mean to tell me that from all those years, that's 24, that's 85 years. So in 85 years that the United States was representing representing slavery and condoned what was going on in the South, I'm supposed to hate the South by themselves for those 4 years that they acknowledged it? It's freaking crazy. I'm done.
It's a great way of looking at things. I guess for me, it's almost like you're looking at that flag issue on a more advanced level than I think most people do. So I guess, just to take the counter argument that these statues and monuments should be taken down, or what is the benefit for some of these, Confederate-based statues and so forth being taken down, it's because if you have a park and a woman is, bringing her child to the park, and either they're white or African American or anything else, and the child looks at this Confederate soldier statue or Confederate general statue and says, "Hey, mommy, what's that?" And then the mommy has to explain, "Oh, we're honoring this Confederate soldier, even though he was a rebel against our country." And if she has to go through this whole conversation about why, 100, 200, 300 years later, whenever this hypothetical conversation happens, if that conversation doesn't happen because the statue is gone, then that's one less reminder of that historical situation. Now, you could make an argument that it's better to have these statues around, and I think Trump made this argument. If you had these statues around, then you can't survive without recognizing the mistakes of the past, and those that don't remember history are bound to repeat it, that axiom. So I can see it on both sides. I thought some folks had made a good suggestion that didn't happen, which is, if all these statues and plaques and so forth could kind of be rounded up and be put into a Civil War museum, or a Confederacy Museum of the United States. And it could be anywhere. It could be in Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Washington, D.C., with the other museums, so that if you had an interest, you, me, or anybody else had an interest in studying the Civil War, you could go and see these statues. And if I'm not mistaken, the Civil War is the war that killed more Americans than any other war, because we were killing ourselves. And we're at a point now, Jamie, which why I'm inspired to do this podcast with you, because you and I have talked about all these things on private phone calls, but also my feeling is, as citizens, we have to fight to survive this year. Not just Democrats win, Republicans win, Biden wins, Trump wins, Kamala gets in office, Pence stays in office. It's not even about that. We have to fight to just stay civil to each other. And things that are happening in Portland, if that was happening here, we have to fight to keep our country in one piece, is my opinion at this point.
Right, right. Yeah, I agreed. The thing is that, I wonder though, like with taking the monuments down, and again, I want to be clear for anybody watching this, I'm not defending it. What I am saying is I don't want to see it done just as a symbolic gesture with no real implementation of change towards meritocracy. That's really what I'm getting at. But like, so then where do we stop? Where do we stop as far as like and taking things down that don't represent where we are as a society right now? I'll give you an example. Okay, so like George Washington owned slaves, was one of the wealthiest men in this country. Him and his wife owned lots of slaves, and but do we take down the Washington Monument? Do we take down the Jefferson Memorial because they were slave owners? Now, if you say, now remember, if we're supposed to be doing this, and I'm not arguing a point. I'm just pointing something out. Okay, I'm not arguing. If you say, okay, well, but Washington was a founding father to this country, and he was not a traitor to the United States. So that's different than, say, Stonewall Jackson, right? But my argument would be to that, my not argument, but my point would be, another point could be, well, he may not have been a traitor to the United States, but this man was in receipt of slaves who came from other countries. So he was an enemy to those people. He was an enemy to those slaves. So if the idea is that we want to be respectful to the treatment of Black people, of African Americans and whatnot, because of the Confederacy and what they represented, George Washington to the slaves didn't represent anything different than what Stonewall Jackson represented. If you're talking about keeping them in bondage, he didn't represent anything different than what Thomas Jefferson represented. So it's like we have to be careful about trying to judge people from the past by today's standards. Now, obviously, there are crimes against humanity that echo throughout the ages. But I'll just say this too. Now, if you look at some words and like the word, and I say this for those watching, this is not intended to be disrespectful. I'll try to sanitize it as best possible, get this point across. But like if you look at some of the clinical health terms, like today, we don't want to use the R word because it's offensive to people, right? If you have somebody who is mentally challenged, you don't call them the R word anymore because that's offensive. But this is actually 100% true, Mike. The R word was supposed to be the sanitized word for the word idiot. Now you call people idiots and we don't even know the history because we'll say idiot, but at one point that word was like, oh my God, you called him an idiot. You got to leave here. You be quiet. And so now we come up with different words. So we keep changing it over and over and over. And like, even with Black people, like, we're called coloreds and Black, African American. Some people can't get the term right. And then some Black people are still arguing like, which term should we call one another, or what term should somebody call us? These terms change over time. So this is one of the reasons why me personally, I'm more concerned about the actual behavior. So with the flags and coming down and whatnot, I am trying to see if this country is going to move towards a more perfect union and going to move towards a meritocracy. Personally, I just don't see it. I really, really don't. I wish I did, but I don't, because we're having conversations that need to be had. But the fact that we have to have the conversation, to me, shows me how far behind we are. When we see police officers killing people who are unarmed, and we're still trying to make excuses for it, all I'm saying is that we convict Black men We arrest and convict black men all day, every day. Well, maybe not the weekends, but you know what I mean. We convict black men all the time when there's no evidence. There's been no evidence that this person committed a crime, like the Karens of the world. Pardon my, no offense to your cousin, but so if the white woman says that this guy did this black guy did this to me or did this, the system, they get the ball rolling. They don't need it to be on video. What are you arresting me for, officer? Because this woman swore out a complaint against you and said you did X, Y, and Z. You can come to court and answer it. Or you can hire an attorney, or the judge will decide, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when we have the actual evidence, then we're still not being treated like humans. And I've said this, and I'll turn it back over to you. We live in a country that was built on human trafficking, but yet claims it was built on, democracy and freedom, and then tells us, okay, this is a meritocracy, even though white Americans create the law for their benefit, they enforce the law to their benefit, and they interpret the law with their benefit in mind. How are we going to have justice in a system like that? I don't believe that we are. I don't see it.
Well, one that's a lot of great points, Jamie. A lot of great points, and one thing that came to my mind during, not just since Memorial Day with George Floyd, although that heightened it obviously, but kind of the awareness that people are going through, and people that never walked in a protest or never shared a YouTube video or never retweeted something, that people are expanding their own comfort zones. I'm talking more about white people to engage in this conversation. And one thing that I've thought several times is that's well and good. That's great. Even myself, talking with you on this podcast and sharing a lot of the things I've shared on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and so forth. But what really needs to happen, in my opinion, is the police have to stop killing black people, unarmed black people, whether it's, and yes, somebody might say, well, George Floyd was high on drugs, blah, 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 and he had a heart problem. But putting your knee on his neck for 9 minutes certainly didn't help that heart problem. And but cases that we talked about earlier, like in Texas, that case still hasn't gotten a lot of national mainstream news, of the woman playing the video game with her nephew, or before, I think it was another Texas case where the female police officer went home. She went to the wrong apartment. She actually went into somebody else's apartment. The guy is sitting there watching TV in his home. She thought it was her home. So rather than just leave and call for help or whatever she had to do until she realized she was in the wrong, she went back into the home and shot the guy in his own home, thinking it was her home. Why couldn't she just leave the apartment building? So
Yeah.
my point real quick.
The Botham Jean case.
Yep. My point real quick was just to say that it's great that the American civilian populace is more open-minded, more willing to think about this stuff, more willing to engage. But at the same time, what really has to happen, in my opinion, is that for whatever reason with the police, they need to be retrained to be less aggressive, a lot less aggressive. I don't want to minimize it. Less shoot first, figure it out later. That's the vibe that I get. It's shoot first, shoot to kill, and then figure out your story later. And to me, that's not acceptable. And I think to a lot of people, that's why there's protests and riots in the street. And granted, some of the protesting and rioting is being infiltrated by other groups that I don't think even have the best part of their heart into it. Groups that really are, anti-American or just want to disrupt things and destroy property. But for the people that are protesting from a genuine place of interest for equality, I think that people just got to a point where they just can't take it anymore, and people feel like they're crawling out of their skin on these topics.
That's true. There's a lot that's going on, and I have noted that there are a lot of white people that are joining movements and that are that are involved in the protest. But the thing is that while that is encouraging, it's really not, for me, from a historical standpoint and studying it, it's really not different though. All of the things that black people have done for the most part were helped out by white people. The Underground Railroad, there were many white people who risked their lives to help black people during that time period. During the civil rights movement of the late 50s and 1960s, there were lots of white people. I think with there were two people that were killed with James Chaney as the basis for I think one was Andrew Maynard as the basis for and I can't think of the other young man's name, but they were killed and that was the basis for the Mississippi Burning movie. There were two white kids that I think they were going in the South, maybe trying to do voter registration or something like that, and were killed by some police officers. So there have been a lot of white people who have assisted and risked their lives. That has been the case, but the elites of the country, this is where the true power has lied, and where they are steadily, they just regroup and reorganize and put in the same stuff. We're still talking about the same thing in 2020 that we were talking about in 1920. And so that hasn't changed, because at some point, as a white person, with what you've done here in this country as white people, what you've built, are you willing to say now, yes, I am willing to compete with you on equal footing and on equal level? And I don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon. And I think we can talk about it like, yeah, okay, I get it or whatnot. But you look at sports. The sports landscape is supposed to be the epitome, the example of meritocracy. But you look in the NFL, it's a league that's like 65% black. We still today have no black owners in the NFL. Now, we don't have, if all these black people have all this opportunity and 65% of the players are black, you mean to tell me that nobody decided to buy a team? It's because of the way the rules are set to keep blacks from buying a team. Because if you want to buy a team, then you have to get voted in by the other owners. If they don't vote you in, you can't buy a team no matter how much money you have. So now, whether that's right or wrong, I'm saying that those types of rules exist in general society. They don't always publicize them, but we can't get those jobs. So in the NFL, you only have a handful of black coaches, maybe 4 or 5, if that. I don't know off the top of my head right this second. I'm a big NFL fan. In basketball, the NBA, you have a few more black coaches, but still in a league that's like 75% black, 75% of the coaches aren't black. And there's only one black owner, Michael Jordan. And he's the only owner that actually played basketball. So if Michael Jordan had to play basketball to own a team, what the hell are all these other guys doing? How are they getting that kind of money if they didn't have to play basketball? Where are they getting it from? So we're being told that our only value pretty much is in entertainment. If you can play football, if you can play basketball, baseball, or you're an actor. So we can play on the field, but when we walk off the field, we're still not equal. And here's what a lot of people don't realize, and I'm a pro football historian. Black people were banned from baseball and football at points in history. Now, whether it was an official ban or not, I don't know if I've ever seen anything in writing, but I know it happened. Now, there were black baseball players in the Major League Baseball before Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson is the first black baseball player in the modern era. Back before we had TVs and radio and all that, some people played. Now, there was one player at least named Moses Fleetwood Walker that we know confirmed was black, and he played years ago in the 1800s. But then there were some players that would show up and people would find out that they were black and they didn't want to play against them. Now, in the NFL, in 1932, they banned black people from playing in the NFL, and they banned them for like 13 years up until about 1945, 1946. Kenny Walker, who was Jackie Robinson's teammate at UCLA, he was the first black football player after the ban. So a lot of people don't realize that. Now, in 1932, the racism was so strong and so pronounced that the Tuskegee experiment started in 1932 as well. And that lasted until from 1932 to 1971, and they were doing experiments on black men with syphilis. Now, what happened is that as treatments got better for syphilis, they didn't inform these black people. They just kept testing them. So let me go back. So in the 1930s, just a few years before that, marriage licenses were made federal. Now, in different pockets of the country, you had to have marriage licenses for different reasons, for all kinds of different things. But the marriage licenses that we know of today that you have to go get before you get married, these were started, and you can look this up. Anybody watching this podcast can look this up. Those were started because the government did not want blacks and whites to marry. And at this time, you had a lot of black people because of, rape and slavery, et cetera, et cetera. You had a lot of light-skinned black people that could pass for white. And so a lot of the populace of the leaders of the country, they wanted to make sure that blacks couldn't get married. And so that's why they instituted marriage license. Now, I've brought this up and people say, no, that's not true, but it is. You can look it up. Anyway, so all of these rules that they've had, they just keep coming up with a new rule to disenfranchise. And it's still happening today. And they keep saying, oh, no, there's no racism. But then they just come up with another rule where we can't get in. The last one I'll say, and I'll turn it back over to you, is that like with these arrest records. So when you see these black people who are arrested and they encounter the police and they go to jail, remember, white America, many people in white America are saying, black people, you guys commit too many crimes. That's why you're going through what you're going through, because you're committing these crimes. So, but remember, Mike, black people, we are not in a position to dictate to white America what is and is not a crime. It's white people telling us what is and is not a crime. So of course, if white people are the ones that are saying what is and is not a crime, of course we're going to be called criminals. On the plantations, white people weren't walking around plantations saying, hey, we're bad people for mistreating these black people like this. This is terrible that we have them in bondage. They weren't saying that. So even now, we're not saying like, okay, we're not saying, oh, this is horrible how we're treating you. It's somehow you deserve it. And so you arrest the people and now we can't get jobs. And see, we didn't do anything. If you hadn't gotten in trouble, you'd be able to get a job. And then when we have clean records, we still can't get jobs. So, yeah, I'm done.
Well, it's like the what you pointed out to me a few days ago, the George Floyd. Has anyone found this $20 counterfeit bill? Was the counterfeit? You said at the time to me on the phone that the police who reported to the George Floyd situation, they didn't even ask to see the counterfeit bill in question before they went after George himself. Is that what you said to me?
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. Go ahead. You're right.
The other, sometimes I get people's names wrong, so jump in and correct me. The big guy was he Eric Garner?
Eric Garner, yes, that's him. Yes.
Okay, the Eric Garner case. And what year was that? 2013?
Man, I don't remember exactly when the Eric Garner case happened.
Well, they're the police, I guess, were, and I apologize if I get the details wrong, folks. But the guy is on the street. He's got 2 or 3 cops around him. He's a huge guy. And he's basically saying, hey, I'm just minding my own business. I don't want any trouble. And they're accusing him of selling cigarettes, And so what happens? He's literally saying, I just want to mind my own business. I don't want any trouble here. And the cop jumps him from behind and puts him in this chokehold. And he's literally saying, I can't breathe. And he just gets killed right there. And, I watched this CNN special with Spike Lee and Don, is his name Don Lemon? And Spike Lee did like a short 3 or 4 minute compilation of Eric Garner, um, George Floyd, and the fictional character of Radio Ahim from Do the Right Thing. And the footage of those three cases, of even Radio Rahim from this movie in 1989, Do the Right Thing, it's all very strikingly similar to each other in a very sad way. So it's tough. Jamie, what would you suggest? You know, because we're at a point here where thinking about this stuff, it can be overwhelming. What can a viewer who's watching us have this conversation? Is there anything you would suggest they do? Not that I'm expecting you to have all the answers, but do you have any suggestions of further education, videos, books, articles? Is there any type of action, or even just a sensibility or a action in their life that people that are watching this can do to make the situation better? Any ideas towards that?
Well, I would hope that people can try to evaluate things objectively. That would be my hope. But I think that human beings are extremely emotional, and as I taught for about 20 years at the collegiate level and various schools, and what I noticed is that like you take some of these police officers and the way that they engage us, like with some of the ones that you brought up today, like with the Ohio situation, you know, you wonder, like, can you evaluate this situation as an officer? Can you evaluate it objectively? And so for white people or black people, for all of us, but let's say in this case, you're talking about white people, when you see these things go down with the police and how black people are treated, how is it that, oh no, let me back up. If you saw this same behavior and a white person was being treated like this, would you have a problem with it? If you would have a problem with it, then for a white person being treated that way, then why don't you have a problem with it with the black person being treated that way? You know, and so a lot of these stories that we are talking about, and like, you know, like when if a woman is saying that she was assaulted by a man, and she was, you know, if she was assaulted, we have shield laws that basically protect her. You know, they don't put her name out there. They don't start saying, well, you know, she was a dancer, you know, at this club in Vegas, and therefore, you know, that's a part of why she was attacked, or it's okay. So why is it okay to constantly bring out, you know, the records of these black men that are killed or black women when it has nothing to do with that particular incident? You know, if the guy was in the middle of a drug buy or drug bust, okay, I get it. But the fact that he was arrested 5 years ago, what does that have to do with what these police officers are doing to him today? And so I think it's difficult for people to be objective, but that would be my answer. Like, can we base what's happening here on facts? When people apply for jobs, can we base the application and the process on their actual abilities without it being about race or gender or sexual orientation or religion? Can we just base it on their ability to do the job? And we just don't seem to have the ability to do that. We keep showing over and over and over that we fail in that regard. And so, like, you know, in reaching out to white America, we still have this symbiotic process. And you brought it up earlier, and you and I talked about it off camera. But we have this symbiotic process where many racists in society, and the tacit racists, they're saying, "Hey, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and call the police and get this ball rolling, and I can stand back and hide and not be accountable for my behavior." And then the police officers are saying, "Well, hey, I didn't do anything. I just was responding to a call." But in the end, it holds together the same framework that had always existed. Lastly, I'll say this to your point, and you said, what can we do? I don't know if I have a direct answer, because we should already be doing it at this point. We had a situation in this country in the 1980s that I lived through where a lot of black men were being arrested for drugs, and we still are today. But I'm saying like that, like the crack cocaine thing was a big deal. And we've already talked about like offline and you see in the media where they talk about the disparities between the sentences for crack cocaine and the sentences for, regular cocaine. Okay, so we've gone over that. But now the United States government in different states, and it'll probably be all of them before our lifetime is over with, that they're allowing marijuana now, even recreational marijuana, okay? And they're expunging some of these convictions, but you ruined black lives for decades behind this. And now you're saying we're going to try to decriminalize, and you asked earlier about defund the police. Let me give you an example of what I'm saying here. Now they're saying we're going to basically they're not saying defund, but they're saying rather than treat all these cocaine cases or these opioid cases, instead of treating all of them like criminal cases, we're going to relook at this and try to get people help. We're going to evaluate those situations a little bit differently. And so now they're taking a totally different look at the opioid crisis, because now they're saying, let's treat this like a medical issue, more so than a criminal issue. But when it was crack cocaine, no, put their asses in jail, put them in prison. As a matter of fact, we had mandatory minimums, 5 years, 10 years. So when asking what can white people do, are you willing to compete fairly for the opportunities available in this country? And if you're not, then we're not going to move forward. We're just not. I'm done.
Well, Jamie, we've had a pretty great conversation, man, and I appreciate you coming on here and discussing these issues. And hopefully, the time we've put into this, if 1, 2, or 100 or 1,000 people watch this video and get something out of it, and their eyes are opened a little bit, that would be great. And I would encourage anyone who's watched this video that feel they've gotten something out of this or provoke them to look into some of these topics that maybe they haven't before, or even if they have, don't be shy about retweeting this video or Facebook sharing or LinkedIn, whatever you want to do. Please, by all means, go ahead. If it's just me sharing the video 10 or 20 times, it won't get as far as it needs to get. Jamie, like I said, you and I could have more conversations, and I hope we do, on more personal film issues, film conversations about the films you're making, the film we worked on together. But if people do want to see some of your work or get in touch with you about film or your websites or your other endeavors, is there anywhere you want to direct them?
Yeah, they can reach me on Facebook. They can reach me on Twitter. I do have a website up for various projects and whatnot, but those are the best places to reach me, on Facebook and Twitter. And can I add one more thing before we finish? Okay. All right. So I wanted to bring up this issue of color real quickly. In the United States, black and white people and many other people, we focus on the issue of color, and primarily black and white. And we say that's what caused the separation, the differences in color. But I want to be clear that in the United States, it was taught for many, many years that black people weren't human. So the issue about drinking at the same water fountain and stuff like that, it was less about two different colors drinking at the water fountain. And although it's not talked about today, but many white people viewed black people as animals. So it'd be the same as like why you don't let a dog drink out of the water fountain. And so that's how we were looked at. Another thing, too, is that there's this lie about indentured servants, as if only white people were indentured servants and the black people were slaves. That's another lie. Many black people were also indentured servants, and some white people were slaves for life. Now, I bring this up because people look at me like I'm crazy when I say this, and this is not defending slavery, but I'm saying we're not as different as we claim. We're just people. The word kidnap, the etymology of the word, dates back in the English language, because kidnap is an actual English word. It dates back to the 17th century and the 1600s, and it was born out of children and young people being kidnapped in Europe and England and being sent to the Americas as slaves to work on the plantations. Now, so this knocks a hole in this. White people were only indentured servants because they obviously they weren't making contract with children as indentures. They were taking them to the colonies and stealing them. So many people were put into bondage in this country. Black people had slaves. You know, Native Americans were given slaves from different times. They bought slaves. Black people walked on the Trail of Tears because when the United States broke the treaties with them, they gave them black slaves, as a part of a settlement of those agreements. So what happened with bringing the children over from England and the young people, and in that book by Robert Louis Stevenson, he kind of deals with it he kind of deals with that topic, but it's not historically accurate. But he kind of touches on it a little bit with the book Kidnap. Robert Louis Stevenson, I think Kidnap came out like 1896 or whatever. But anyway, so you had a situation where when we had the bubonic plague in England, or when they had it in England, they began to then look for a different source of cargo, a different source of slaves. And so they began to negotiate with African nations to get slaves. Now, in the early 1800s, and like in Jefferson's third year, this is the last thing, I promise, many people think that the United States stopped bringing slaves over because that was just a good thing to do and they were just nice about it. But no, actually, and I've never seen this in a history book. I read this and studied this, but the United States got into a war with some nations in the Barbary coast of Africa, the northern coast, and they got into a fight. And, you know, the United States says that they won to this day. But what happened, though, what came of that is that the United States stopped going to Africa to get slaves right after that. So I think it was like 1806, 1807, you know, Jefferson came out with this, you know, law, whatever. We're not going to go get any more slaves from Africa. But that was directly related to the pushback that they got from the Barbary Coast War. Now, why this is instrumental is because up until that time, there were actually a lot of white slaves. Not as many as black people, but they were phenotypically white like you. But if you can imagine the United States fighting a country now, or if you can imagine like how people felt about the Japanese, remember in World War II, they put the Japanese in internment camps afterwards in the United States. And these were Japanese Americans, but most of them had never even lived in Japan, but they put them in internment camps. So imagine fighting a war against African nations in the 1800s, how black people would have got treated. So a lot of the laws that we saw against organizing and stuff like that, and black people being in the group, some of that came from, a great deal of it came from the war that we were having with the African nations. And after that, you started seeing less and less white slaves. And nobody even talks about it today, you know, but because we've been lied to as if there were no white slaves. But anyway, so that's it. So my point is that a lot of white people who think that they're better than black people because, quote unquote, they weren't slaves in this country, it's not actually true. A lot of people were slaves in this country, but the propaganda machine and the divide and conquer mentality was set to divide and make sure that whites and blacks couldn't work. And the very last thing I'll say is because on many of the plantations where there were rebellions, if you study the early rebellions, there were white and black slaves rising up. So the divide and conquer tactic was, we got to separate these people somehow. So we got to tell the poor white slaves, we got to tell the white slaves or the poor white people, you're different than the black people. But anyway, that's it. I'm done.
Great points, and we definitely do another interview in a week or two or something like that. I would refer people in the meantime, like I said, check out this YouTube gentleman, Dane Calloway, Dane Calloway, Calloway. The first video I watched of his was called "History Was Told to You in Reverse." And Dane just recently released a series on the who's to blame for the slave trade. And this guy reminds me of the conversations you and I have had here today, Jamie, and also several phone call conversations where we kind of dig deeper into all of this stuff and how it's affecting us today. One thing that might be the proverbial elephant in the room, so to speak, is, throughout our conversation today, I don't think either one of us uttered the term Black Lives Matter, and that wasn't by design. It's just, to me, that's a whole other conversation, which I would like to explore with you at some point, but not today, because we are running out of time here. But the conversation would be, what's the difference between the Black Lives Matter organization and the catchphrase or the hashtag or the expression? And when we see things like the NBA, the National Basketball Association, have the Black Lives Matter mantra on their court, what's the difference between what they're doing there and the actual website, the actual organization? I don't claim to have the answers, and I'm not asking you to right now, but maybe in our next conversation, that can be one of our starting points, Jamie, if you're up for it.
Absolutely, brother. Absolutely. I enjoyed being a part of the podcast. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you, Jamie. And what I would say is that this guy, Jaime Reborn, and I have been friends for 10 years. We finally got to meet in person in Dallas, Fort Worth, just about a year ago. Jamie was the director, producer, writer of Write It Black. Had a great cast with Dean Edwards, comedian Dean Edwards, Mary. What's Mary's last name?
Mary Legault.
Mary Legault from the TV show Life on Top and many other projects. Name some of our other cast members.
We had. I'll just say now. Mary's dad was Lance Legault. He was the colonel on the original A Team that was tracking them down when the series started. I just want to throw that in there. But we had Charmel Huffman. She's married to WWE Hall of Famer Booker T. We had Daryl Mooney, who's one of the Paul Mooney's twin sons. We had Thomas Wood Ellis. He is a professor. Tenured professor at Fresno State. He was my theater professor back in college many, many years ago. And then we had, of course, Mike Messier, who's been involved with a whole lot of other people. I really enjoyed it. We had Jamie Nieto, a two-time Olympian and actor. And Jamie just sent me some clips of him on the TV show with the TV show Away with Hilary Swank.
Right.
Yeah, he played in there, and his wife, she did a great turn. His wife, Siobhan Nieto, she's off in the film and Write It Black as well. She did a great turn on America's Got Talent.
They just had a baby. Congratulations to them for having a child together.
Absolutely, yeah. They sent me some pictures and everything, and it's we had a great cast. I really enjoyed the project, and it was a good learning experience. And of course,
Canadian comedian, I believe.
Oh, that's right. Adam Richmond was in the project. Very funny comedian.
The king of quarantine comedy.
Yeah. You had a college girl from Texas.
The college girl from Texas who took. I mentioned her because she took a lot of the photos that I use on my webpage about the movie. What was her name? The college girl.
The one from UNT. Her name was
Pat.
Alice.
She played
Alice.
Pat.
Alice Wren. Yes.
Yeah.
Alice Wren played Pat. Yes. Yeah. And and then we had
the big guy.
We had Bernard Campbell that played King Leroy.
Yep.
And am I missing anybody?
Well, your makeup lady was really nice. Your DP had a lot of his family involved.
Yeah, Dorothy Littlejohn did the makeup, and Dwayne Watson was the DP and the editor. And when you come down here in March, I'll have to show you where we are with hopefully we'll be finished with the film, but I'll show you the cut that we have. We're working on the second cut. So.
Well, go ahead, buddy. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you go. No, you go ahead.
It's just people might be wondering, and it's interesting, Jamie. In the last couple of months, I'm not sure when, but I started sharing more of these. I guess you'd have to call them politically loaded tweets and articles about the current state of the country and the state of the world, and I didn't realize the great vast amount of different views based on people's comments in some of my sharing. And hey, look, I'm not going to condemn anybody for expressing their opinion. If I'm going to share an article or share a tweet or something, then people are welcome to make a comment. But some of the responses, I was a bit surprised, their perspectives. But I try not to cancel culture anybody, or I try not to block anybody if their opinion isn't in sync with mine, because my hope is that if I continue to raise the topics, maybe people will be a little bit more open-minded with what they're thinking. But in case anyone's wondering, well, Mike, why do you care? I'm not getting hunted down by police today. But to me, if you're a citizen who it's that old expression. I think about World War II. First they came for the Polish people, and I wasn't Polish, so I did nothing. Then they came for the homosexuals, and I wasn't homosexual, so I did nothing. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to protest because I was the only one left. I mean, if you ever,
Right.
I'm sure I just butchered that
Yeah.
expression.
Yeah, I've heard it.
Yeah, but whoever said that, I mean, it's a better quote than I gave it credit for. But the basic gist is, if you're not looking out for your fellow man, your friend, your friends, in the community, if they're gone, you're going to be missing something from your life. So, I mean, I think it's the responsibility of everybody, if you want to call it white privilege or whatever you want to call it, but um, you just have to be aware that this does affect everybody. If it's your friend who's getting unlawfully arrested or harassed or killed or discriminated against, I mean, then that affects you too. Because
Right.
because nobody's truly equal or free unless everybody is truly equal or free.
Right.
And that's why we're doing this podcast. And there's other things we could talk about. I mean, we talked about sports a little bit. I mean, I found it interesting, this whole Stephen A. Smith, I thought, made a great point about the hire of Steve Nash. He wasn't coming down on Steve Nash, the coach, the new coach of the Nets, but he was just kind of questioning the process of the hire a little bit. And of course, Stephen A.'s comments gets more crossfire than the topic that he raises. So yeah, there's a lot of things we can talk about, but I'm sure we'll have you on again, man. And I appreciate your time tonight. And
Yeah, we're all on this. We're all on the same team. We're all on the same team. And that, like, remember, the black people that are here. We're not new. We've been here for generations now. So we've been here as long as everybody else for the most part. And so it's like, we are United States citizens. Treat us like it. We didn't come here yesterday. We worked. We helped to build this country up. We've earned it. So just give us the same respect that you want for yourselves and that you give to each other. So that's it.
Jamie, I appreciate your time, my friend, and have a great night, my brother.
All right, bro.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.